The organizer of this joint event were very wise. The three sessions were really well put together. The second session, the Korean Peninsula and the surrounding powers, it has presenters with articles that are thought-provoking, some even original and provocative thinking. And some, I'll comment some of them later. But for the sake of time, I will be very brief in introducing the presenters because you can read yourself and just highlight some points that it seems important. That whenever there is a U.S.-China economic or security issues are in question, whenever any issues arise in Far East, Northeast Asia, Gordon Chang seems to be in demand. The Congress wants him, CIA wants him, Defense and State Departments seem to want him, or think tanks of Brookings and Heritage Foundation and Cato and Rand invite him, or the news media want him. Even Jon Stewart had him in the Daily Show, and he currently writes regular columns for the Forbes magazine. And Gordon Chang presents a view in this article that I think is almost contrarian. The popular view is North Korea is so dependent on China, and China says jump, then North Korea will say how high. And Mr. Chang presents another kind of view. Actually, he's arguing that Chinese influence on North Korea has been eroding in recent years, and he presents very persuasive arguments why it is so and the implications of that. Thank you, and here's Mr. Gordon Chang.
Well, the real issue is, does my wife want me? But that's another story. Last week in Beijing, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel asked China's leader Xi Jinping to do more to disarm North Korea. In February, Secretary of State John Kerry, also in the Chinese capital, was goading his Chinese counterparts on the same topic. Now, the Chinese are getting a little bit peeved with all of this attention. Beijing's ambassador to the U.S. last week was moaning about how Washington is leaning on China to do something about its only ally, North Korea. And he said, quote, "You are giving us a mission impossible." A decade ago, China chose not to use its influence on North Korea. But today, I think it's lost a lot of that influence. And that's why the Chinese ambassador can talk about missions impossible. What I think has occurred over the last decade is a stunning loss of Chinese influence. And when we look at that loss, we should start with the execution of Jong Tak in December. China, after that execution, lost not only its most important contact in Pyongyang, but it was also demonized. Because the Kim regime, in trying to explain why it executed Jong, looked at Jong's economic relations with China. I think Chinese officials were genuinely surprised by the purge of Jong and finally his execution, and that shows how much influence and access they have lost in recent years. When Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong ruled their countries, these two states professed to be, and they often were, lips and teeth close. And you can understand why. Because both leaders were communist, Confucian, Chinese-speaking, and chubby. So it was no question that relationships between the two states would be conducted on a leader-to-leader basis. Yes, there were severe disagreements then, but they maintained strong ties. These days, however, there has been a rupture. And the question is why? Well, Kim Jong-un had given Uncle Jong Tak almost complete free rein to deal with the Chinese. And so this almost complete delegation meant that when, in late 2013, when Jong Tak was executed, it meant that Kim Jong-un had to actually rebuild his ties from the bottom up. If Kim had stopped with the execution of his uncle, that would have been one thing, and ties might have been relatively unaffected. But Kim Jong-un started his reign of terror because he went after the patronage networks of Jong Tak from the bottom up. because Jong Tak had friends and allies not only in Pyongyang, not only in major cities across North Korea, but also down to many of the municipalities. So as this young leader has been eliminating Jong Tak's network, he's also at the same time been eliminating his contacts with his most important benefactor, the Chinese. So at this point, you can see Kim Jong-un is trying to rebuild his lifeline to the Chinese capital. So for instance, he sent one of his envoys, Kim Ki-suk, to Beijing and Shenzhen in February looking for Chinese money. As the Chosun Ilbo has reported, however, Kim came back empty-handed. And it's interesting in the sense that Kim Jong-un also seems to be rehabilitating some of Jong's allies because of their expertise and their knowledge of China. And there are reports that Kim Jong-un has rehabilitated two of Jong's allies recently. One of them, the ambassador to Beijing, because he needs somebody in the Chinese capital to represent North Korean interests. Now, the Chinese, for their part, have tried to reciprocate by rebuilding ties from their side. They have sent over two foreign ministry delegations to North Korea in the beginning of this year, one of them in January and the other in February. And this is really unusual for the two delegations to be separated only by weeks. Well, of course, there's no secret why the North Koreans need the Chinese. Chinese cash, and it's not just aid, but it's also the proceeds from trade and investment, have made Pyongyang even more reliant on Beijing. And it's really been the reason why the North Korean economy has done better in recent years. Now, the actions of Kim Jong-un, however, hardly reflect this dependency, because after all, he did execute Jong Tak, and he's gone after the patronage networks, so he's been deliberately taking down his ties with the Chinese. And also, Kim undertook actions last year, such as the third nuclear detonation, the long-range missile tests, and even an abrogation of the Korean War armistice, which really was something that the Chinese were upset about. Now, Chinese have to be asking themselves why their policies have apparently failed, why they failed despite everything to gain the obedience and the respect of their destitute neighbor. Since the time of Kim Jong-il, the balance of power, I believe, has been tipping in favor of the weaker party. And there are several reasons that explain this seemingly paradoxical loss of Chinese clout. And it's paradoxical because it's occurred at a time when North Korea has been depending even more on Chinese money. And so there's 6 of them that I'll talk about today. First of all, the Chinese authorities, as a practical matter, do not control the flow of cash into North Korea. Second, pro-North Korean elements are now ascendant in Beijing. Third, the U.S. is bypassing China in its dealings with North Korea. Fourth, Beijing is undercutting its own power in the region with its increasingly assertive actions. Fifth, rising Korean nationalism means that all outsiders are losing influence on the peninsula. And 6, you have regime instability inside Pyongyang, and that means outsiders are not going to have the same access that they once had. And what I'll do is I'll discuss each of these in turn. First of all, China, just as a practical matter, does not have that much control of the money going into North Korea. Although statistics do show China's increasing dominance in the North Korean economy. Largely as a result of China's mineral purchases, trade between China and North Korea jumped 10.4% last year, reaching a record $6.5 billion. And it appears that the People's Republic has substantially increased its share of North Korean trade last year because Pyongyang, after all, did close the Kaesong industrial complex for 5 months because it wanted to show its displeasure towards Seoul. So as a result of this long interruption in production, inter-Korean trade dropped 41.9% last year. Moreover, there's been few reliable figures about investment capital going into North Korea, but it does appear that China has kept up its role as the primary supplier of investment. Chinese money is clearly changing the DPRK. So for one thing, the flood of China's cash has created, or at least it's contributed to, a mini boom by North Korean standards. The figures aren't in yet from the Bank of Korea, but it does appear that 2013 is the 3rd straight year of increases in gross domestic product in the North Korean economy. Yet Chinese leaders don't get influence for all the money flowing into the North And this anomalous situation is attributable to various factors. So for its initial matter, China's investments are such that North Korea exercises a high degree of control of the flow of money that comes into the North, because a lot of this money comes from state enterprises in China. It's large scale, and therefore, under North Korean rules, requires approval from the Pyongyang authorities. Moreover, the North Koreans have figured out that China is making many of its investments for strategic purposes, and therefore they will pay dearly for the privilege of controlling portions of the North, such as Rason, which is the port where the Tumen River empties into the sea, and also areas close to the mouth of the Yalu, which is near the Chinese city of Dandong. The North Koreans, knowing that Beijing must have what only the North Koreans possess, have made their larger neighbor overpay time and time again. And finally, Beijing has lost control of some of the money going into North Korea because this is small-scale investments by private entrepreneurs, and so therefore it leaves China under the nose of Chinese regulators. So the Chinese, despite what they may think or say, have apparently made a decision to support Kim Jong-un despite what he does. And this is important because what we are seeing is a delinking of China's diplomacy and its economic relations with the North. So this is patience. Some people may call it indulgence, but whatever label you put on it, it works against Chinese influence. Second, pro-North Korean elements are now gaining power in Beijing, and it is almost certain that Kim Jong-un has figured that out in recent years, that the military in China has become much more powerful in Communist Party circles. Well, this trend means that Kim Jong-un doesn't have to worry about the civilians in Beijing, many of them who detest the North Korean regime. It appears that Xi Jinping, in order to rule effectively, has made the People's Liberation Army his personal political faction. And so, therefore, Xi Jinping can't say no to the generals and admirals. Now, this apparent ascendance of the PLA profoundly affects ties between Beijing and Pyongyang because the PLA is considered to have special equity in those decisions that Beijing makes regarding the Korean Peninsula. And it has special equity because the PLA lost almost 1 million soldiers in the Korean War. And Chinese military officers are known for having pro-Pyongyang views. And it's no surprise that they do, because the ties between the North Korean and the Chinese military were forged in blood, they have been held together by shared perceptions, and they're reinforced by business dealings. So it appears, therefore, that the ascension of the military in Chinese Communist Party circles has given Kim Jong-un something like immunity. And this immunity, of course, tends to reduce Beijing's influence. It means that, of course, Kim has the initiative, but it also means that China's foreign policy has taken on a passive tone, even a tone of acquiescence. And acquiescence, of course, by its very nature, represents a loss of influence. Third, a frustrated Washington is taking China out of the game. At the beginning of this century, the Chinese were becoming the center of peninsular diplomacy with the start of the six-party talks, which were all held in Beijing. And Chinese diplomats at first were very involved in this process. As they mediated, they cajoled, and they threatened the 5 other parties to the talks. And that gave them great leverage. Leverage not only over the United States, but also over North Korea as well. But as we all know, that this special role didn't last, because the Chinese were not able to push the North Koreans in better directions. And that meant the six-party process has essentially disappeared. Now, the Obama foreign policy team had reacted to this development by essentially trying to deal with the North Koreans directly. And so this, of course, marginalized the Chinese influence by taking them out of the game. And the result of this, or one result of this, was the so-called Leap Day deal of 2012. Well, that deal didn't last for more than 2 months. But on the other hand, China did not regain influence when the arrangement fell apart. So, despite the failure of the Leap Day deal, China has not regained its position at the center of nuclear diplomacy. Now, it is true that American officials will still troop to Beijing to talk about North Korea, as Chuck Hagel and John Kerry did earlier this year, but their efforts aren't going anywhere. So China's influence is not recovering. It's natural for Beijing to try to restart the six-party talks, but because of course that would restore its position and therefore its ability to influence the North Koreans. But their efforts look half-hearted. And I think that they're half-hearted because the Chinese have realized that they have missed their moment on the Korean Peninsula. So the bottom line is that China's failure in the six-party process has led to a loss of their position of general influence. Fourth, Beijing is undercutting its bargaining power with assertive actions in the region. Everybody likes to talk about how relations between Beijing and Seoul have warmed up recently, and people remind us that Park Geun-hye made her second foreign trip not to Tokyo, but to Beijing. And of course, everyone knows that China is South Korea's largest trading partner. They're now negotiating a free trade deal, and if they can put it into place, that will help cement relations. People have called Park's policy towards Beijing and Washington sort of like a G2 sort of arrangement, which seeks to maintain good relations not only with the Chinese but with us. And in some ways, this sort of resembles the policies of one of her predecessors, No Mo-hyun, who was in the Blue House between 2003 and 2008. No Mo-hyun sought to distance his country from his longtime ally, Washington. And of course, the Chinese just love this policy. But despite this superficial resemblance between Park's and No's policy, Park has one important difference, and that she is not letting her Chinese initiatives undermine the security relationship with the United States, because she realized that that is the bedrock of South Korean security. Now, the Chinese have bitterly complained about Seoul's pro-U.S. drift since the years of No Mo-hyun, but they have nobody to blame but themselves. I think Chinese policymakers need to make a number of fundamental shifts before they can have stable ties with the South Koreans. They will, for instance, I think, have to end their country's special relationship with the odious Kim regime, for one thing. Because although China is perceived to have special influence with the North Koreans, and that gives South Korea more incentive to deal with the Chinese, nonetheless, it also tars Beijing in the eyes of the South Korean populace. And we saw that, of course, in 2010 with the sinking of the Chonan, 46 dead, and also the shelling of Yongpin Island, 4 killed. Now, Beijing had an opportunity to win over Seoul at that time, but unfortunately for the Chinese, they decided to stand with their North Korean ally. And that outrage in South Korea, and especially the outrage over the deaths of the 2 civilians and the shelling of the island, I think has really tarnished Beijing. And essentially what has happened since then is Beijing has been making wrong decisions. Pyongyang has been forcing Beijing to make wrong decisions on the Korean Peninsula, and that has perpetually strained ties with Seoul, and I see that continuing into the future. Also, the other thing that Beijing will have to do before it has stable relations with the South Koreans is that it will have to give up its expansive territorial claims on South Korea. And of course, the flashpoint is Aido. Beijing these days is in no mood to compromise its territorial claims, and of course, this angers the South Koreans. Moreover, Chinese tactics to take over Aido have aggravated the situation. So, for instance, Beijing's declaration of its East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, which includes airspace over Aido and closely abuts sovereign South Korean airspace over its offshore islands, is something that is an issue in the South Korean capital. Now, China initially tried to portray its ADIZ, as the air zone is known, as something which was targeting only the Japanese. And that is, in fact, what Chinese told their South Korean counterparts a few days after the declaration of the zone last November. But Beijing, however, refused to redraw its air zone away from Aido and the South Korean offshore islands, and so that makes it clear that the air zone was an attempt to dominate the entire East China Sea, to the exclusion of not just the Japanese, but the South Koreans as well. And if Beijing goes ahead with its declaration of a Yellow Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, as some people have been talking about, well, that will inflame an already difficult situation. Moreover, China's continual encroachment on South Korean waters in South Korea's exclusive economic zone, of course, leaves bad blood between the Chinese and the South Koreans. In 2011, for instance, Chinese fishermen who were trolling in South Korea's EEZ fought a pitched battle with the South Korean Coast Guard, killing one South Korean sailor. So this aggressive Chinese conduct with regard to South Korea is not isolated, of course. It's part of a broader pattern. China's militant nationalism is creating friction in an arc of nations from India in the south to South Korea in the north. And as Beijing lashes out, countries in that arc are becoming apprehensive, and they are looking to each other for protection from a much more aggressive China. And of course, this whole process undermines Chinese influence across East Asia, just as it is now doing in South Korea. So essentially what the Chinese are doing is they're forcing the South Koreans to remember all of that unhappy history over the course of centuries where Koreans and Chinese were adversaries. So in the absence of these fundamental shifts that I've been talking about, I think the Chinese can merely play to the anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea, something that was evident when Xi Jinping and Park met on the sidelines of the Nuclear Security Summit in Hague in March. Now, of course, passions can rule every country as it can rule South Korea, but ultimately I think that the Chinese will lose influence in Seoul as they undermine South Korea's core national interests. And eventually, the South Koreans, I think, will come to the realization when they look at a map that nobody can defend their homeland without the active cooperation of Tokyo. So I think over the long term, at least, I do see much more cooperation between Tokyo and Seoul. And of course, that will undermine Chinese influence in South Korea. So, in effect, what I'm saying is that Beijing's influence in South Korea has already passed the high tide mark. Fifth, the rise of Korean nationalism diminishes outsiders' influence. You know, we look at the sunshine policy of Kim Dae-jung and the peace and prosperity of his successor, No Mo-hyun, and some of us, including me, think of it as sort of this naive attempt to engage the North Korean regime. But perhaps you can look at it another way, as it being merely an expression of Korean nationalism. And of course, the policy of any administration in Seoul, regardless whether it's progressive or conservative, is the survival of the Korean state. Now, Korean nationalism today may not be as evident as it was during the time of Kim Dae-jung, but it still is the dominant force on the peninsula, always present and always strong. And in a land that was colonized for 4 decades and has been split in two since then, I think nationalism is on a general upward trend. Well, of course, that's not good for the Chinese because the Chinese have often been the enemy of Korea. You know, the boundary between Korea and China has shifted hundreds of miles in both directions over the course of centuries. And now, of course, there are many ethnic Koreans who are citizens of the People's Republic of China. And of course, that's a reminder to the Koreans of prior Chinese conquests. Now, I think eventually we are going to see South Korea compete more effectively with the Chinese for influence in Pyongyang. And when that happens, I think South Korea certainly will gain influence and China will lose it. Because then, of course, Kim Jong-un is going to play off the South Koreans against the Chinese, just as his grandfather pitted the Chinese against the Soviets. So it follows almost inevitably that China's influence in Pyongyang, whether you think it's great or whether it's little, is really at the sufferance of the Blue House. And that thought must, of course, be uncomfortable for Chinese leaders. Sixth, regime instability in China, in North Korea, is making China lose its ability to influence Pyongyang. At the end of February, the official Korean Central News Agency carried remarks by Kim Jong-un about the infighting at the top of his regime. You know, during the purge of Joseon-tak in December, the North Koreans, for the first time since the days of Kim Il-sung, talked about instability inside North Korea. You know, because the Kim family has built its power by making the point that it has the love, devotion, and support of all Koreans, well, talking about infighting at the top of the regime clearly undermines a position. And so clearly this infighting must be severe. And so for as long as this instability lasts in the Korean peninsula, in Pyongyang, and I think it could last years, China will, like everybody else, be looking in from the outside. And of course, that means China is going to continue to lose influence in the North Korean capital. Let me conclude by saying, of course, that what I've been talking about is a minority view. Most people believe that China has increased its influence in Pyongyang recently. Matter of fact, the famed Korea watcher Aidan Fawcett Carter wrote an essay entitled "South Korea Has Lost the North to China." And in this he wrote, quote, "Seoul blew its chance. North Korea's future now lies with China." And of course, there are many observers in Seoul who would agree, who believe that China has increased its influence in sort of a vacuum that Seoul has created. But even if Seoul has created this vacuum in the North Korean capital and has allowed the Chinese to flood in, I'm not so sure that they will be able to benefit even over the medium term. Because in late March, Chosun Ilbo reported that Kim Jong-un ordered the hanging of posters and signs with a quote from his grandfather. And that quote is, "China is a turncoat and our enemy." It's not clear why Kim Jong-un ordered the hanging of the signs, but I think over the long term, we have to say that China poses a fundamental challenge to the North Korean regime. Because the People's Republic, after all, represents modernity and progress, and modernity and progress are threats to a Kim state, which can survive only in a closed environment. I think that the Kim rulers have always known, not only this one, but the previous one, that they cannot follow China's path because economic reform and all of this hectoring from Beijing about economic reform poses an inherent threat to the future stability of the North Korean regime. And perhaps that is the ultimate reason why, in a time when the North Korean leader is so insecure, that China will continue to lose influence in North Korea. Thank you.
You may agree or disagree with Coach Chang, but he did present a view that his thorough attention. China, North Korea, China, South Korea, triangular relationship. You add Japan and Russia, it gets very complex. It's been a long-term relations, complex relationship. And to do a full comprehensive analysis on these elements that Mr. Chang brought to the analysis needs to be looked at. That is the leadership patterns of China and South Korea, and the roles played by People's Liberation Army, North Korean Army, and so on. And then the party, Communist Party, and the roles leaders play, and relations between the party and the military, and so on. The idea that Xi Jinping's ascension brought greater power to People's Liberation Army and played a big role was a very revealing information, to me at least. I'm sure it has generated some questions in your mind, and we will have some time after all the presentations are done. And next is a very preeminent scholar, writer, leader of organizations of scholarly and civic, Dr. Hong-Ah Kim, who's a professor of political science at West Virginia University in Morgantown. He has authored 130 plus articles and books in many prominent journals. And he has written one of the great powers around it, Japan and South Korea, especially since Shinzo Abe's ascension to power in Tokyo. So, Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My paper is a little bit long, and I don't think I would be able to present the whole thing within 20 or 25 minutes time limit. So what I will do is I'll try to condense it as much as possible and explain why the relationship between Japan and South Korea deteriorated so rapidly since 2012. There were basically four issues which have strained the relationship between the two. As many of you know, the first one is Abe Shinzo's now famous revisionist view of history, which was pretty much expressed in his testimony before the upper house plenary session of the upper house in the Japanese parliament in April last year, 2013. There, let me mention first that as far as Abe is concerned, he first tried to make sure that his government is not going to abide by the Murayama Statement. Murayama Statement was issued by then Prime Minister Murayama Tomichi in 1995, in which Murayama apologized for the Japanese imperialism and the militarism which inflicted a great deal of sufferings on the Asian people. And that apology, which was issued in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the Japan's unconditional surrender, 1945, was upheld by every Japanese cabinet ever since. Now here, as far as Abe is concerned, his first government even acknowledged that and upheld, that statement. But all of a sudden, in the spring of 2013, he declared that he's not going to uphold that statement in its entirety because there are some parts of the statement which he cannot agree. And he went on to say that as far as Japan is concerned, Japan did not commit essentially aggression to anyone. That was his basic position. The next day, he was questioned by a member of the upper house regarding Japan's aggression in Manchuria, China, Southeast Asia, Korea, etc. And here, Abe tried to evade the question by saying that the definition of aggression is yet to be firmly established by the international community or intellectual community, he said. Because depending on where you sit, it looks different. That's what he was basically saying. In other words, from Chinese point of view, it was aggression. But from Japanese point of view, it was self-defense. That's what he was saying. He then said, Japan has not committed any aggression to anyone. Now here, let me explain Abe's historical so-called revisionism. In other words, as far as Abe is concerned, he wants to revive the grandeurs of the lost empire. And for this purpose, what he would like to do is to do away with the seamy side of Japanese history, especially that part which deals with Japan's aggression in Asia. And so what he tried to do here is simply to either hide the unpleasant past or distort it if possible. And he tried to evade that whole thing. Here, let me also mention that as far as Abe is concerned, he even denied that the Class A war criminals, there were 28 of them, and I think 25 of them were sentenced, found guilty and sentenced to either by hanging or execution or the lifetime imprisonment, etc. But here, as far as Abe is concerned, in his book, here I have his book here, Utsukushii Kunie, Okay, this was published in 2007. And here, if you look at the page 59 to 62, he mentions that these criminals, Class A criminals, were not the criminals under the Japanese law. And there's nothing, I mean, they should treat them as a criminal, which is, essentially denying the verdict of the Far Eastern Military Tribunal, which found these guys guilty and sentenced them to a death or long-term imprisonment, you see. And that, I mean, really provoked not only Chinese, but the Koreans, because there are so many Koreans who are still remembering. There are many Koreans who still remember Japan's brutal rule of Korea from 1910 to 1945. Japanese tried to exterminate Korean culture. They wanted to exterminate, do away with Korean names. They wanted to do away with Korean language. Koreans were not allowed to speak Korean in public places. And this is the way how the Japanese behaved in Korea. And here, this guy is saying that we did nothing wrong. And how would you feel if you were Korean? Of course, I mean, you will be pissed off. Okay? Then, I mean, the United States obviously cautioned the Abe government because he was challenging, you see, the very authority of the Allied powers, you see, which occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952. According to the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951, Article 11 stipulates that Japan accept the verdict of the Far Eastern War Tribunal. They accepted it. And here, Abe is challenging that basically, or trying to negate that, I mean. And so the United States cautioned them, better not do, excessively on this thing because it can bring about a lot of friction with Americans too. So I think in the beginning of May, Japan more or less decided to step back from this part of, I mean, revisionist view. But then came another major development in December 2013. What happened here was Abe paid homage to the Yasukuni Shrine, where over 2.4 million Japanese war dead are enshrined. And in addition to that, from 1978 on, 14 Class A criminals who are, I think a majority of them were executed, were also enshrined in this Yasukuni shrine. And starting from that point on, even Japanese emperor like Hirohito or Akihito, they stayed away from Yasukuni shrine. They stopped visiting Yasukuni from 1978 on. So this is why, as far as Japanese prime minister is concerned, incumbent Japanese prime minister generally stayed away from it, except a couple of them, namely Nakasone Yasuhiro, 1985, and then Koizumi Junichiro from 2001 to 2006. But there's a subtle difference here between these previous prime ministers' visit to Yasukuni versus Abe. You see here, as far as Abe is concerned, he is a historical revisionist, whereas Nakasone and Koizumi are concerned, they were not. Especially Koizumi's case, although he visited Yasukuni Shrine 6 times, he, issued an apology to the Asian people, just like what the Murayama did. But in this case, I mean, Abe's case, as you can see it, he denied Japan doing anything wrong, or did anything wrong during the war period. And then he say he's going to pay his homage to the war debt. Okay, so therein lies, the difference. You know what Abe said when Koreans and Chinese and others began to criticize his visit to Yasukuni? He said, I went there not to worship war debt. I went there to report this year's progress made under my administration to these war debt. He then also said that I went there to make sure that Japan will never go to war again, and the people will never suffer from war again. In order to make that pledge, I went to Yasukuni. My question, and for that matter, many people's question is, why the hell you went to Yasukuni? Why not go to the Peace Park in Hiroshima or Nagasaki? You could go there and offer that type of pledge, and it would have been much more credible than going to the Yasukuni and making, offering that type of stupid statement. Kind of afterthought, excuse. You see what I mean? So that strained our relationship. Incidentally, as far as Yasukuni visit is concerned, it was not the Koreans, not just the Chinese, but the United States was very, very unhappy about that situation. This is why U.S. Embassy in Tokyo issued a statement in which it expressed the United States disappointment at this guy Abe's visit to Yasukuni, because it is causing a great deal of frictions in East Asia. Okay? So the United States sent its message fairly clear to Abe. And I think Abe has to think twice, now, before he could pay another visit to Yasukuni in the future. The third major issue here between Korea and South Korea and Japan pertains to Abe government's attempt to revise the Kono Statement. The Kono Statement was issued in 1993 by then Chief Cabinet Secretary Kono Yohei. And it was in this document, or in this statement, Kono admitted for the first time that the Japanese military was directly or indirectly involved in the forceful recruitment of so-called comfort women, and also the operation of comfort stations throughout Asia. Okay? Now, as far as Abe and his ultra-nationalists are concerned, that statement is not acceptable, because it, in a sense, does a great deal of damage and insult to the Japanese pride, so to speak. So what the Abe tried to do here is he tried to nullify that statement in 2007. I'm sure many of you remember. He tried to do that. He came even to the United States and met with George Bush, President Bush, at that time. You know what? He didn't offer apologies to Koreans or Chinese comfort women. He offered his apology to George Bush. Why? George Bush, he didn't say anything, about that. Or it was not, George Bush who criticized Japan. Japan was denounced and criticized by Koreans and Chinese and others whose women were violated by Japanese, as a comfort woman or prostitute, forced prostitute or servitude, you may say, as a sex slave to the Japanese military. Now, this announcement, in other words, the plan to nullify the Kono Statement was officially announced by Chief Cabinet Secretary by the name of Suga Yoshihide. Suga is number 2 man within the Abe government. Now, what he said on February 28, 2014, this year, was that in order to re-examine some of the evidence used in the drafting of the Kono statement, he was going to set up a team of investigators within the Japanese government and to see especially whether or not the testimonies given by the 16 Korean comforter women back in 1993 were valid or not. You see what I mean? Dr. Larry Nick is here in the the audience. He's a well-known scholar in this field. He has written a famous congressional research memorandum on the Japanese comfort woman system. And if you read that document, you see Kono statement was not drafted on the basis of the 16 comfort women's testimony, but rather it was based on Japanese, American, Dutch, and Korean, Chinese, other documents. There are several hundred documents. And Japan cannot simply deny, or distort, these documents. Documentary evidence is right there. And some 200 documents were dug out by Professor Yoshiaki of the Chuo University. According to Yoshimi, he found at least 126 or thereabout of documents in the Japanese, self-defense forces library, military library. And also he found something like 56 documents from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs document. And also he got additional 20 or 30. So a couple hundred documents he dug out, and the revelation of these documents by Professor Yoshimi in 1993 precipitated or prompted Kono Yohei to come up with that apology of 1993. You see what I mean? But here, Abe and the Suga try to hide the fact, and they think simply by looking into the testimonies given by 16 Korean comforter women would, cast so much doubts about the validity of their testimony that can nullify the Kono statement of 1993. That was a stupid move on the Abe government. And Abe came to realize that that was not going to fly. So what did he do? On March 14, this is just 1 month ago, March 14, 2014, Abe declared in the upper house session that he has no plan to change the Kono statement of 1993. So in other words, what he said in his testimony before the Japanese Diet was that he's not going to change or nullify or retract the Kono statement. He also declared that his government is going to uphold Murayama statement of 1995 too. So in other words, here for the first time, Abe came up with a clear-cut statement that his government is going to uphold both Murayama statement and the Kono apology all at the same time. And this apparently pleased South Korean government. President Park Geun-hye went on, expressed that press conference that she was encouraged by this turn of event. She, I think the exact word was, she was relieved because Abe came up with this statement. So this, in a sense, settled the issue for the time being. I say for the time being. It's not permanently settled. Why? Because there are some Japanese cabinet members who are trying to, nullify, or to change Abe's statement here, or position, once more. Hangyu Koichi, for example, that guy is assistant president to Abe Shinzo. And what he said was that depending on the outcome of the re-examination of the testimonies given by these comfort women, Japanese government can come up with a different statement on comfort woman thing, and that cannot be ruled out. And then there was another guy, this guy Shimomura Hakubun, who is Minister of Education. He's another ultra-nationalist and well-known historical revisionist. You know what he said? He said that the Kono statement was not approved by the Japanese cabinet. Murayama statement was not approved by the Japanese government. In other words, what he was saying was, in both cases, Murayama statement and Kono statement were not the quote unified view of the Japanese government, unquote. Why? Because they were not approved by the Japanese parliament. Then this guy Sunga came to realize that this was a real bombshell that got to be removed. So he quickly put away that statement by saying that as far as Hangyu's statement is concerned, it's his personal view and not representing the Abe government. Now, as far as this guy Shimomura Hakubun is concerned, Shimomura corrected, quote unquote, he corrected his original statement by saying that yes, Murayama statement was approved by the Japanese government. As far as Kono statement is concerned, it was not officially approved, but it represented the general consensus of the Miyazawa government. Miyazawa Kiichi was prime minister at that time, the Miyazawa government. So what he was saying was these two statements represented the Japanese government view. Virtually that's what he was saying. Okay, my time is already close to up, but let me go over one other issue which strained the relationship here between Japan and South Korea, and that is Dokdo Takeshima territorial dispute, Japanese-Korean territorial dispute over Dokdo Takeshima. I'm sure many of you have heard about this, but not too many people know details. So let me explain why this issue is such an emotional issue, which is more likely to bring about exacerbation of relationship between the two in the future. First, within next time, a couple minutes, let me explain the background of Dokdo dispute and why Koreans regard it as Korean territory, or why the Japanese believe it belongs to Japan. First, let me explain. As far as the Japanese are concerned, Japanese maintain that Takeshima, Dokdo, Koreans call it the Dokdo or Takeshima, or Ryangkur rocks, was a terra nullius. Terra nullius under international law means ownerless island in 1905. And this is why they discovered it and they incorporated it as a part of Shimane prefecture. Then it's been controlled by Japan ever since. But as far as the Korean government is concerned, the Koreans basically saying that it was not the terra nullius, it was Korean island, okay, which Japan recognized as Korean territory all the way back to 1696 by Tokugawa military government, or by the Meiji government in 1877. Okay, we have documentary evidence of that. Iwakura Tomomi was one of the most powerful leader or Genro, or the elder statement of the Japanese government at that time, 1877. He is the man who signed that Dr. Takeshima, our government, Japan has nothing to do with it. So he, signed that document, and it was understood that that belonged to Korea. Okay. Anyway, let's now look into the post-1945 period here. Now, Japan lost the war in 1945 and was subjected to Allied occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952. It was during this Allied occupation of Japan, the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, issued a directive on January 29, 1946. It's known as Skip-in number 677. And in that directives, he ordered Japanese government to exclude Dr. Takeshima from Japanese jurisdiction, and separately, and together with Korean Peninsula and its offshore islands, all of them were returned to Korea. Unfortunately, at that time, Korea was under the U.S. military government, and therefore the jurisdiction was transferred to the U.S. military government in South Korea. General John Hodges' government more or less came to control Dokdo and the entire Korea at that time. Okay, and then in June 1946. General MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, issued another directive, number 1033, in which he told the Japanese, or he banned Japanese from approaching 12 miles of that Dr. Takeshima. Okay, and so Japanese fishermen or anybody who could, approach that island at that time. Then in 1948, general election was held in South Korea under the supervision of the United Nations, and the Republic of Korea was established on August 15, 1948. Okay. So what did the United States do? United States military government in South Korea transferred all of its jurisdiction to the Republic of Korea. And the Republic of Korea came to control jurisdiction over entire South Korea, including Dokdo. And the Republic of Korea's legitimacy was approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 12, 1948. So Republic of Korea became a, full-fledged independent state by December 1948. Now then came the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951. Now, in this treaty, there's nothing pertaining to Dr. Takeshima. In other words, San Francisco Peace Treaty 1951 is completely silent on that. And this is why Koreans believe that, Dokdo belonged to Korea because there was no new stipulation in the treaty that contravenes the original action taken by General Douglas MacArthur in 1946, which was incidentally based on the Cairo Declaration of 1943 and the Potsdam Declaration of 1945 and the Instrument of Surrender of September 2nd, 1945. All of that, plus SWNCC, that is State War Navy Coordinating Committee of the United States, adopted policy number 59-1 in June 1946, in which it said, Dokdo belonged to Korea, historically administrative, and they should be returned to Korea. So, the Koreans believe that it was returned to South Korea, legally, you see, by the United States and by the Allied powers. And there is no provision in the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951 which contravenes, that original decision. But the Japanese are saying two crazy things. One is that Japan never renounced Takeshima to Korea. Of course, I mean, they didn't have the right to renounce it. It was not their right to renounce or define the scope of Japanese territory. The right to define the scope of Japanese territory was in the hands of the Allied powers at that time in signing the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951. Another thing, the Japanese say, the United States wanted to return Takeshima to Japan, and this is why it belongs to us. The United States refused to give it to South Korea. Now, I will give you one important evidence that was not the case. You all know John Foster Dulles, who was instrumental in drafting the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951, and he was U.S. Secretary of State in 1953 under General or President Eisenhower. You know, in December 1953, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State Dulles, dispatched a secret telegram to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and also Seoul, saying that Japanese want the invocation of U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, or it wants U.S. help in getting the Takeshima and the Dokdo back, Takeshima Dokdo back. And John Foster Dulles said, the United States was only one of the 48 Allied powers which signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And the United States' view does not represent the 48 other signatories, the 47 other signatories' view on this issue. And therefore, we cannot accommodate or accept the Japanese request here. He rejected it and turned it down. And that meant that the United States would not, want to deal with this issue anymore, you see. And Dulles asked Japan and Korea to negotiate and work it out. Starting from 1954 on, Japan started to propose that maybe we better take the case to the International Court of Justice. The South Korea said, no, we're not going to take it to International Court of Justice. Why? It's ours, and why do we have to take it to International Court of Justice for judgment, or litigation, and that thing. Well, in spite of all these, grievances and complaints, you know what the Japanese did? Japan signed basic relations treaty with the Republic of Korea in 1965, and they normalized the relation there. And in that treaty, the basic relation treaty of 1965, there is no single provision pertaining to Dokdo Takeshima. In other words, this means Japan acquiesced to South Korea's claim to Dokdo Island at that time. You see what I mean? But in 2005, they resuscitated or revived this stuff, rehashed this thing one more time. The so-called Takeshima Day was sponsored by Shimane Prefecture on February 22nd, 2005. And what they were trying to do there was to commemorate Japan's takeover, Takeshima 100 years ago from Korea. Or as Tella Nurius, as they call it. So this is the way how this Dokdo Takeshima dispute became such a big deal in Korean-Japanese relations. And as far as Korea is concerned, it has no intention to take the case to the International Court of Justice. Now, this means the only way Japan can take it over from Korea is by going war against Korea. And the Koreans are not going to simply sit idle like what they did back in 1905. They're going to fight. Okay? So this means it's a very, very unfortunate turn of event that the Japan Abe government, here specifically, tried to adopt adopted actually, has adopted this new guidelines on Dr. Takeshima for the teachers of high school and junior high school history classes. What he said was, Takeshima Takeshima is an inherent territory of Japan, which is illegally, I'm quoting here, illegally occupied by Korea, South Korea. Now this is planting seed of hostility or animosity here, enmity here between the two nations. Now if this type of thing is allowed to continue, I think down the road, there will be war between Korea and Japan on pertaining, to the territorial claim of Dr. Takeshima, and so it's a very, very unfortunate development here. Actually, when he took over power in December 2012, Prime Minister Abe said that he was not going to make a big deal out of Takeshima issue in order to cultivate friendly ties with South Korea. But he changed his mind, and I think toward the end of February 2014, he declared that Japan is going to take the case to the International Court of Justice. Again, whether Japan does it or not, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really amount to anything unless South Korea agrees to take the case to the International Court of Justice. You see what I mean? So it means, very little here. Since my time is up, I will quickly summarize the whole thing in next 1 or 2 minutes, okay, in the form of conclusion. Now here, as far as the conclusion, number one is concerned, as you can see, the Japanese-Korean relations were strained the past 16 months of their part, largely because of Prime Minister Abe's revisionist view of history. That's number one. Number two, he tried to, on the basis of this revisionist view of history, he tried first to revise the Murayama statement. When that didn't work, he then came up with a third one here to revise the Kono statement in February 2014. When that didn't fly, then he changed his mind and he declared that he was going to uphold both Murayama and the Kono statement. Instead, the Murayama and the Kono statement regarded as landmark apologies issued by the Japanese government in the post-war period. And here, Abe was going to destroy them, but he failed, and he decided to forget about it. That's what happened. Dr. Takeshima case, I have already explained, upon that. And then Yasukuni Shrine visit, I mentioned also that, as far as this thing is concerned, the Koreans and Chinese regard that as a symbol of Japanese militarism. And according to Australian daily paper, it said it was regarded as source of Japanese warmongering days of the past. You see, a symbol of warmongering days of the past. It's not my statement. I'm quoting, here, the Australian newspapers' characterization of Abe's visit to Yasukuni Shrine. The last item here. Well, as far as Japan is concerned, I think Japan is entitled to have a larger role in international politics. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think Japanese-Korean cooperation is needed to cope with North Korea's nuclear threat and also the rising power of China. And both countries, subscribe to democracy. Both countries subscribe to market economy. And we are, sharing common values. And yet we're not getting along too well, here. Because as far as the Japanese are concerned, they try to hash and rehash the same stuff over and over again, just like a revolving door. One government apologize, and then the next government come up with negation or denial of that. And it seems like the vicious cycle repeated indefinitely. That's a very, very unfortunate situation. I hope things will improve now that Abe at least decided to give up a revisionist view of history for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for a very detailed and I believe very convincing illustration of points of explanation that brought relations between two countries to such a strained, tension-filled atmosphere. The many Koreans believe that if Allied forces should have divided up Japan instead of Korea to study the war, as they did to Japan, Germany. But Abe Shinzo and his extremist views, I think they are going to regret it. Among one thing they did was Korean Americans are really united, which is very rare sight to see. The Northern Virginia Koreans got together and they passed a legislation in state legislature calling the Sea of Japan to be co-written as a East Sea. And they are pushing for the same legislation in Albany, New York. And another thing they did was the Koreans are now being united in many places with the Jewish Americans to possibly one day to form a Holocaust museum of East Asia unless they start doing this. I think I don't know why they do such a losing game. In the long run, it's clear that they will lose. The last but not the least, and perhaps in a way, a very important article will be presented by David S. Maxwell. I got acquainted with David by attending several sessions of Institute of Korean Studies, Korean American Studies in Capitol Hill. And I learned that he was an expert in security studies, not just from research, but through expertise forged out of many years of actual experience in East Asia, most of which was in Korea. And he presents here an article that is, in my view, very unique, original, hopeful, and most major points I fully agree with him. And I'd like to hear his presentation. And it's too bad that the papers of this session the printed versions are not entirely available for you, but they are available online. Please take a look at his paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to KEI and HRNK and ICKS. It's great to be here. The title of my presentation is "Should the United States Support Korean Unification, and if so, how?" So I think you tell from the title that I think we should. The first point I'd like to make is that the United States policy of strategic patience has really led to strategic paralysis. And this strategic patience is really not a strategy at all unless you subscribe to the adage that having no strategy is a strategy. We've not been able to solve the two major problems we've already talked about today, to solve the nuclear issue, nor to stop the crimes against humanity that have been occurring really for the last 60-plus years. An elimination of the nuclear program by force or forcibly liberating North Korea, the North Korean people, do not appear to be feasible, suitable, or acceptable options at this time. And yet, diplomacy has not succeeded either. Now, although we've had had peaceful unification as the end state for the alliance since the Joint Vision Statement of 2009, reaffirmed by President Park and President Obama in May of 2013, we really have not seriously discussed or pursued unification from a strategy perspective. But now President Park's leadership is providing us an opportunity to think seriously about unification and, most importantly, to develop a strategy around unification. The key assumption that I make and why unification is important is that I think it is the best chance for producing peace, stability, and security in Northeast Asia in the long term. And so I think that assumption is the foundation for my thesis here. Now, if I was to develop a strategy, the first thing I'd want to do is develop an end state. And I would say that the end state that we should think about for envisioning the Korean Peninsula is to have a stable, secure, peaceful, economically viable, non-nuclear peninsula reunified under a liberal constitutional form of government determined by the Korean people. Or said another way, under the ROC government. Why support reunification? Well, first, we need to look back in history. We should look to the Korean Armistice of 1953. Paragraph 60 states pretty clearly that the Korean question must be solved. That paragraph called for political parties to for all the parties to come together and determine a political solution to the Korean question 3 months after the signing of the armistice. More than 60 years later, we haven't done that. But the armistice recognizes that the division of the peninsula is unnatural and wrong, and it must be, that Korean question must be solved. I think there are also practical reasons. I think that unification ultimately will reduce defense costs for both the ROC and the United States. For obvious reasons, unification means that there is no more threat from North Korea. I think there's also moral reasons that we should consider, and we should look hard to the history. We've heard quite a bit of history between Korea and Japan, but we should also recognize the role that the U.S. has played in Korean history. If we go back to Taft-Katsukura Agreement, we know that led to the colonization of the Korean Peninsula. If we look at the decision in 1945 to use the 38th parallel as the dividing line between Soviet and U.S. forces taking the Japanese surrender, that, of course, led to the division of the peninsula. Even though that was done, I believe, in good faith to try to, and ultimately prevented communist domination of the entire peninsula, it led to the division of the peninsula. Most importantly, I think we have shared values. I think that the Miracle on the Han shows that Korea, developing economically, culturally, politically, shows that our values are very, very similar between Korea and the United States. And most importantly, the ROC and U.S. are blood brothers and blood sisters who have sacrificed to keep the Republic of Korea free. Now, in talking about unification, there are obviously many challenges. I'd like to just briefly touch on an ideal path or a straight line to unification from here to unification. First, we must think long-term and take a long view, and we must consider all our actions through the lens of how it will contribute to unification. I've kind of coined the 5 R's here that would outline a path to unification. That would be respect, reconciliation, reform, rebuilding, and then ultimately reunification. Switch between reunification and unification there. Many plans have been proposed by many governments, really north and south, on how to achieve unification. And although I lay out a path of respect, reconciliation, reform, rebuilding, and reunification, obviously this depends on North Korea contributing to that and deciding to do that. And I think we all agree that it is very unlikely that North Korea is going to agree to peaceful unification, given the nature of the Kim family regime and that their vital national interest, as Bob Collins has emphasized earlier for us, and General Talleli, that survival of the Kim family regime is the single vital national interest. However, we should plan for peaceful unification. We should use that for a framework, realizing that there are really 3 other potential paths to reunification. The first one we've talked a little bit about this, and some of the earlier questions have raised this, is internal resistance leading to regime change. We know that there is growing internal resistance, unlikely at this time, in my assessment, to lead to regime change from the bottom up. But that would be a path, and one that I think we would find acceptable if there was a regime change from within that led to a regime that wanted to pursue a peaceful path to unification. The other two paths are obviously much more dangerous. The first one that we worry about is collapse of the Kim family regime, and all of the problems that will lead to. And we've defined collapse as really the loss of central governing effectiveness of the Kim family regime, combined with the coherency and support of the military and security services. When that breaks down, then we are likely to see the collapse of the Kim family regime. The problem with that is, when faced with collapse and faced with a threat, internal or external, it may lead Kim Jong-un to make the decision that would lead to the fourth path, and that would be war. He may feel that if threatened, if his survival is threatened, the only option is to initiate his campaign plan to reunify the peninsula under North Korean domination, thus ensuring the survival of the Kim family regime in his calculus, even though we know that he would not be successful in war. So those are the four paths that we would follow, and I think that we should look at and use the straight line path as a framework for understanding all the things that must be done for unification. And whether there is internal resistance, regime collapse, or war, that path that we determine in all of those actions to achieve reunification, once the situation is stabilized after collapse or after war, we would get back on track. And so that's why I think that we need to look at reunification from a long-term perspective, and I'm optimistic that President Park's leadership is now providing that opportunity to look at unification. So if you accept that we should support unification, how should the United States support Korea, the Korean efforts to reunify? The number one action that should be taken by a President of the United States is to express his or her support for Korean reunification in any speech about the Korean security situation. And I would also say that supporting President Park's leadership in this area is not leading from behind. Okay, it is really a true equal alliance partner supporting another partner in its quest to achieve the end state. The second action that the U.S. should take would be to direct the national security apparatus to plan and actively prepare for and support a ROC strategy for reunification. Again, even though since 2009 we've had peaceful reunification as the desired alliance end state, I think it's clear that the U.S. national security apparatus has never focused on that and achieving that end state. And so we really must think hard about that strategic guidance that two presidents have provided. As we've already talked about and General Talleli mentioned, we should support President Park's policy of trust politique, as well as her Northeast Asian Peace and Security Initiative. I think that those two initiatives are very important, both for reunification relations and for Northeast Asian security. Along with directing the national security apparatus to plan and actively prepare for reunification or supporting reunification efforts, we really need to eliminate the stovepipe focus on Korean issues. There must be a U.S. strategy with balanced and coherent ends, ways, and means, and an acceptable risk to support the overarching ROC unification strategy. All the disparate activities that focus on the Korean Peninsula must be synchronized and orchestrated with the single-minded focus on the end state. We've got to stop thinking about just economics, just diplomacy, just military and security operations, and realize how they fit together. Now, the one takeaway from the situation on the Korean Peninsula, I think we'd all agree on, it is complex and it is uncertain. No one can predict what is going to happen. and there's so many variables and possibilities. And again, as General Tillelli mentioned, I don't think we can emphasize hard enough the potential for miscalculation by the Kim family regime make things very difficult to plan and prepare for. However, if we develop a well-grounded strategy that is executed by leaders that have organizations that have the agility to deal with the range of security and diplomatic problems resulting from North Korean action, while remaining, as stated, single-mindedly focused on an end state of unification. Now, let me talk about some specific ways using the instruments of national power. From a diplomatic perspective, U.S. relations with China, Japan, and Russia are important, although right now, perhaps relations with Russia are quite questionable. And in fact, we should consider what is happening with Russia and Ukraine and the impact on just as an aside, for those who would argue that we should give security guarantees to North Korea, I think a North Korean view of Ukraine and the 1994 Budapest Agreement would, might make North Korea think that any security agreement reached with the United States might not be worth the paper that it's printed on. From a North Korean view, I think that they might not trust any agreement with the United States. Questions about the long-term presence of the U.S. forces on the region are going to have to be resolved as well. This is obviously a rock decision to either request U.S. forces to stay or ask to leave. But there are obvious impacts on the region after Korea is unified on whether U.S. forces remain or not. And that could be a separate discussion. The U.S. can also use its position on the UN Security Council to try to ensure that there are supporting resolutions are proposed and acted upon. However, again, given the current situation with relations with Russia, it is unlikely that we would be able to get any resolutions passed, which means I think we need to go back and look hard at UN Security Council resolutions 82, 83, 84, and 85, which were passed in the summer of 1950 to deal with the North Korean attack, and to see what remains relevant, since they still remain in force and can be used to provide legitimacy for whatever actions are necessary to unify the peninsula. I heard last night from a scholar, a Korean and Russian expert, who said that given the relations with Russia and Russia and the United States, it is unlikely that we will ever be able, or at least in the near term, ever get a resolution passed on Korea dealing with unification, because Russia will veto it. And I think we need to keep that in mind. From an economic perspective, and we can talk about, there are people here who know much more than I do about the economic impacts of unification, although I'm hearkened by President Park's use of the word bonanza or jackpot for unification. What I think is important about that, though, is not looking at the negative costs of unification, but looking at the opportunities for investment and what that may return. There's a lot of things that need to be done in North Korea, a lot of investment in infrastructure, but there's also great opportunities for return on investment in the long term. When there's a country that has 80 million people with the industry and ingenuity of the and experience of the South and the resources of the North, there is a lot of economic potential on the Korean Peninsula. And as I've said, the most important element to success will probably be investment in North Korea to be able to properly use the natural resources that are present and develop future industrial capacity and the infrastructure. The U.S. government, though, should be prepared to establish economic policies that will encourage U.S. industry also to invest. There'll be great competition and certainly the chaebols will have, I'm sure will have primacy. But international investment in the North will be very important, and the U.S. should encourage U.S. industry to invest. And the ROC and the U.S. government should also consider if it is possible to work out procedures under the current free trade agreement that would help bring U.S. investors to the peninsula when the time is right. And lastly, when reunification occurs, before reunification occurs, and while the Kim family regime is still in power, the U.S. may consider lifting some economic sanctions to support diplomatic or informational efforts of the ROC, as well as to possibly lay groundwork for future economic investment during the reunification process. Now, obviously, sanctions are going to remain in force to achieve the effects that we want to achieve, but there may be a time when we want to loosen them, particularly as we think we're moving closer to a time when the real process for unification can occur. This, of course, is very controversial and really must be assessed to see how it will support long-term and make a long-term contribution to unification. From an information perspective, the number one consideration has to be getting information into North Korea, to the population, as well as to the second-tier leadership. The second-tier leaders, those are really on the periphery of the elite and have control over key elements of the military, the maneuver forces, the corps, and other elements of the security apparatus. Getting information into them and influencing them to support the unification process is very, very important. Experts in strategic communications from both the U.S. and Korea, psychological operations forces really need to work together to develop those effective themes and messages to influence attitudes, opinions, and behavior of key target audiences. As mentioned earlier, in the first, the defectors that exist, that are present in South Korea, are a tremendous resource, and they should be employed, as Bob Collins said earlier. We're seeing they're getting information into North Korea with great effect, and that should be encouraged. I was heartened to read yesterday that the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor put out a call for projects aimed at human rights and democracy in North Korea. That's a good start. However, Open Radio for North Korea, one of the handful of private radio stations that targets North Korea, has reportedly ended broadcasts because apparently a grant from the U.S. government has run out, and that was used to pay for its ability to transmit information into North Korea. That is something we need to fix. If that was not effective, an effective means of transmission of information, so be it. But if we are shutting off information flow to the North because of budget constraints, I think that's a self-inflicted wound. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. We need to think longer term than that. From a military perspective, first and foremost, the most effective and most efficient military organization is required to be able to handle the full range of military operations, from provocation to war to regime collapse to post-conflict and post-collapse operations. And this most effective and efficient military organization already exists in the ROC U.S. Combined Forces Command. However, with the upcoming OPCON transfer, whenever it may occur, it really means that we're going to dissolve that warfighting command and separate it into two warfighting commands, one ROC, one Korean. ROC U.S. supported command and a U.S. supporting command. I will tell you from personal experience, and I've served with all 5 treaty allies in Asia Pacific, and while we have great relations with all 5 treaty allies, there is no military organization, U.S. Japan, U.S. Philippines, U.S. Thailand, U.S. Australia, that can match the Combined Forces Command. And so whatever happens in the future, I think we really need to ensure that we maintain the Combined Forces Command, because that is really what is the most effective military organization to operate in Northeast Asia. And as we talk about conditions-based for this OPCON transfer, we ought to consider that the number one condition is the existence of the threat from North Korea. And as long as there's a threat from North Korea, I do not think we should disband or dissolve the Combined Forces Command. We also have to consider the United Nations Command, which of course remains on the peninsula to maintain the armistice and also serve as the UN headquarters to be able to integrate other international forces to command and control should hostilities resume and those sending states or other UN states may contribute forces. However, what we really don't know is how the UN command could contribute to supporting reunification of the peninsula. That is, of course, the UN command established by those UN Security Council resolutions, and the U.S. is the executive agent of the UN command. It's a responsibility of the U.S. to determine how the UN command should operate. Now, as there's growing internal resistance to the north, I think South Korea, the Republic of Korea, should determine if it is feasible and desirable to support that resistance, and if that resistance can contribute to reunification. If so, the United States should be prepared to support the Republic of Korea with an unconventional warfare campaign that would support the internal resistance in North Korea. Finally, ROC and U.S. military forces need to continue to refine the plans for the full range of contingencies from provocations to internal resistance to regime collapse and to war. And again, all the plans need to have the single alliance end state specified, unification, so that all military organizations develop comprehensive plans that will complete the entire missions. We should ask ourselves, if such plans and actions do not contribute to reunification, then we must consider the efficacy of conducting those actions or developing those plans. The U.S. has practical and moral reasons in supporting reunification of the peninsula. While the past 60 years have shown the importance of deterrent military forces, it should be recognized that the status quo cannot be maintained indefinitely. And furthermore, as I've said, only unification will produce an acceptable security situation in Northeast Asia. Most importantly, unification provides a long-term policy and strategy focus that can cure the current strategic paralysis that exists, particularly with U.S. policy. Both ROC and U.S. presidents have stated that peaceful reunification is the desired end state, and whether it is achieved through peaceful means or not will be up to the Kim family regime. However, planning and conducting the necessary preparations as part of a comprehensive strategy can provide the alliance with the flexibility to address and perhaps mitigate the effects of any of the contingencies. And regardless of those contingencies, the alliance can remain focused on the only end state that will end North Korea's nuclear program and stop the horrific human rights atrocities that have occurred for the past 60 years. President Park has provided us with the opportunity for the alliance to develop a long-term comprehensive strategy, one with balance and coherency amongst ends, ways, and means, but with agility to address any of the paths to reunification, whether it's the ideal or straight line path, internal resistance, regime collapse, or the worst case, war. We cannot predict what will happen, but we can devise a strategy that focuses on this desired end state and that will allow us the flexibility and agility to deal with any of these contingencies. And I will stop there and be ready for questions.
I'm truly impressed and feel as if I made a great alliance. This session was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. We started 20 minutes early. And taking the liberty as a moderator, I wish to speak, if you don't object, for about 2-3 minutes. A good friend of mine, Dr. Chang retired professor of economics at Jong University, has written a book in 2012, summer, a book entitled 통일은 대박이다, Unification is Bonanza. About 6 months later, on January 6th this year, Madam President Park, in press conference, in response to reporters' question, There are many people in South Korea who fear that unification will be too costly and to be too unsettling, too disruptive, and so on. But I disagree, and I think unification would be bonanza. The next day, presidential approval rating jumped to 10% more, from 53 to 64%, and it's been staying ever since. So it has some popular support as well. And her statements in Davos that unification will bring not just bonanza for South Korea, but North Korea as well, and to the powers around it as well, was very well received. And her presentation in Dresden, 3 points: the humanitarian help, and the infrastructure building of North Korea, and then there's 2 Koreas that have been divided for 60-some. Next year will be 70 years. 2 societies that has become so different. It needs to be brought back together again, and efforts need to be made, and resources need to be contributed. 3-step plan. And toward the end, this is a very important point. She said, now the Korean press and American press reported this as if these 3 conditions will be contingent upon North Korea's giving up nuclear weapons. I read her statements 3 times with underlining and highlighting, and she didn't say anything like that. Believe me, you can go back and test it. Toward the end of her speech, at the end, the last paragraph states that these are my proposals, 3 proposals. But if North Korea should give up nuclear weapons as well, a lot more will be coming. That was her statement. It's not the 3 points of advancement will be contingent upon North Korea abandoning, giving up nuclear weapons, but it will be a booster. So the 3-step plan she proposed would go on regardless of what North Korea will do with nuclear weapons. And actually, David Maxwell starts with a very realistic appraisal. North Korea will not give up nuclear weapons. We can hope for it, we can twist their arms for it, but it will not give up. You know that. You know that, and I know that. And for the pressing of human rights, it would be very satisfying that we must do it, but it's not going to improve human rights condition of North Korea. Those are the given. North Korea's Kim dynasty, unless it falls, it will not be achieved. We have to take another step. David Maxwell and my friend Dr. Shin is on one agreement point. That is, the world's policy toward North Korea should be 2-pronged. North Korea should be approached, North Korean government, the Kim dynasty should be the tooth-to-tooth, eye-to-eye. Very strong defense position and ready for any provocation they might make. That stance should never be compromised. On the other hand, our approach should be directed to North Korean people who are really suffering. There is a London Times Beijing bureau chief, who is now Tokyo bureau chief, Richard Lloyd Perry, who has written a review of Victor Char's book on North Korea, Impossible State, seems to agree with me, usually citing this choco pie incident in great detail. And I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, I'm very, very moved that Mr. Maxwell's article is is asking the American policymakers to help support Madam President's presentation on how it is to be done. My friend's view of North Korean the unification is contingent upon 4 conditions. 1, for 10 years after unification, North and South Korea should be placed under 2 separate economic zone systems to prevent massive migration and not a very delicate arrangement of push and pull factors, so that North Korean people, although starved, will be given enough incentives to stay where they are and improve their life condition where they live, instead of moving to what life would be immediately better. Lots of preparation needs to be made for that. Another point is, for 10 years or more, American troops should stay in the Korean Peninsula, and even North Korean leaders seem to have agreed to do that. Kim Jong-il is supposed to have said that to DJ Kim when they met in Pyongyang in year 2000. So North Korea is not going to be standing against the going to say Americans should move out unless we will continue the status quo. The third is that the real estate of North Korea, unlike Germany, Helmut Kohl, the chancellor at the time of German unification, said that West Germans who moved out of East Germany, who left the property there, could reclaim their lost property. It was a huge mistake. And we are proposing that North Korean real estate should remain national property. And that people who lost their property would be given not in-kind restoration, but cash, monetary return after the unified Korea establishes enough of capital to do so. And then there will be a 10-year period of Buy Korea policy. This will stand up against the WTO and to lobby against it will need the help of KEI and others who are think tank people in that regard. And I want to talk to anybody who wishes to talk about that. But one question is about Russian veto. The Russian think tank has come up about a year and a half ago, last year early, said unification of Korean Peninsula under the domination of South Korean system will benefit. Russia will not oppose to do that. So it will be, in spite of Ukraine, Russia will not be an impossible entity there. So there are others. But this book, the Korean version and English version, will be available by hundreds of copies. In Annandale, you may just find a Korean monitor. And you can purchase it from there. And money will be given to International Council for Korean Studies for planning of events like this, say, for next year. Author does not want any royalty for that. Okay, now we have two very distinguished discussants. The first is Professor Jong of Hollins University, a very well-known, widely respected political scientist, and who has contributed numerous articles and papers and presentations at conventions, especially at International Council for Korean Studies in the past. And Dr. Hugo Kim, you heard of him enough today about how, without him, this event would not have been possible. A real hard worker who looks for difficult work and do that, carry it out. He's the president and founder of East-West Research Institute, and he currently teaches courses at Washington Baptist University. And one last note that his effort to support this unification, I and a few friends of mine are forming One Korea Foundation. And once we get the IRS approval, we'll start moving by the end of this year. And I hope you become interested in it and talk to us about that. Now, Professor Ra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you all hear me in the back? Great. Let me start it this way. These are three outstanding papers, replete with exhaustive reference to data, appeal to details that are masterfully organized in a way that make them both interesting and important, in my opinion. And I find it daunting to add anything to them, but I'll give it my level best. The other shoe invariably has to stop, right? Let me start with a very small introduction of my source, one of my sources. When DJ Kim became president, he decided to reform the intelligence network, intelligence institution of South Korea. And as you know, Jong, the Central National Intelligence Bureau, consisted of three subdivisions. One exclusively concentrated on intelligence with regard to North Korea. Second one, external intelligence, corresponding largely to CIA work. And then finally, the third one, domestic intelligence. I guess it corresponds to the American FBI. He decided to combine the first two, thereby making those two, very briefly they stay that way, making them essentially the Korean analog of American CIA. The person who was appointed was a very unlikely one, because his mission was to purge the organization of its elements that previously were charged with abuse of power against the dissidents, domestic dissidents, rather than engagement in foreign affairs. Well, it happened to be my younger brother. So he's one of my sources that I'm going to use. He's a funny guy in some ways, because he comes out with some weird hypotheses, speculations about what could have been. So I want to entertain you a little bit with some of what he said, in addition to the usual scholarly sources that I may have to appeal to. Dr. Chang's paper is an extremely intelligent one, and in my opinion, important one, although he admits that it's a minority view. The majority view is, majority view makes it sort of a swim, makes his proposition swim upstream against a set of very strong factors that unite or bound the two countries, PRC and North Korea. And that is the ideological symmetry that we all know about between the two, and the partnership between during the Korean War that started in June 25th, 1950. Rather than partnership, it was PRC that saved the neck of North Korea in the second phase, as you very well know. And then third, and not certainly least important, is enormous dependence on the part of North Korea on China for military and energy purpose. So against this backdrop, to propose that somehow Russia is slackening or losing its influence on North Korea, they have a rough time to defend. So my conversation with my brother produced the following scenario. So I'll let the experts to judge the validity of this particular view. It consists of a sort of a political equatic equation. The first variable has to do with the relationship between PRC and North China. That could be, strangely enough, defined as mutual symbiosis in this case, symbiotic relationship in the sense that they need both. Now, the popular view is that PRC's need for North Korea's existence is much less advertised than the other way around, except that there are three other possibilities that enter here, and that is the relationship between China and North Korea that I've talked about. And second, enter the two other countries, Pakistan and India, in the following sense. PRC finds Pakistan, I don't mean Pakistan, India as its chief economic rival, especially in global trade. Anything that slackens or distracts the pace of constant progress, awesome progress on the part of India's technological industry and others, is an advantage to China's competition in this case. Now, Bruce Bechtold this morning talked very, very comprehensively about North Korea's role in providing a variety of weaponry to a number of countries, including African countries, but particularly to Pakistan. By providing this, and including possibility of uranium as well, And we all know about the rancorous and the belligerent relationship between Pakistan and India. India finds it necessary to slow down the pace of economic focus of necessity to defend itself, which in turn disadvantages PRC's quest for seizure of unquestioned hegemony in economic sphere of Northeast. So that's where North Korea, it is believed, provides an indispensable role for PRC's continuing domination in economic terms. But that's his view. That's my brother's view. And I, before I came here, sought his permission to quote him. It's odd to ask for permission from my younger brother, but that's the way it was. So I just wanted to toss that out to see how that bounces before you. And that's probably all I want to say about that in the interest of time. And then about Professor Kim's paper, I'm just absolutely overwhelmed with his exhaustive historical knowledge and minutiae of details and data. I do have some questions that I'd like to ask, and that is the 5 reasons that he gives, the denial of wrongdoing that he talked about, Yasukushi visit, refusal to apologize, Tokto dispute, and Japan's quest for greater international role through the bolstering of Japan's defense capability. All these are very plausible arguments. What I would add to my wish list, not as a contradiction by any means, is I wish his argument would add a degree of intensity that convinces me that Abe regime is truly a standout among the past backdrop of Japanese policy. After all, Tokto dispute went for a long time before Abe took over. And the denial of comfort women matter, or even to the extent, at least under Abe regime, the chorus led by him was sung loudly by a provincial governor who said that there was no need to deny the existence of comfort woman because comfort woman was a necessary component of efficacious function of a military. Now that, I would say, is the ultimate of refusal to apologize or admit. He, in fact, rationalizes the use of it in his patriotic zeal. So there's no doubt that Abe's regime went to the extreme, but I wish there had been a little more cogent argument that established the standout nature of Abe's regime as a revisionist government. The second question I'd like to ask is, why is Japan doing this? What is the cost-benefit analysis? I really have a rough time. So I called my brother because, among other things, after he resigned from the chiefship of KCIA, he was later, after he became UK ambassador, he became also, as some of you may know, ambassador to Japan. He was forever vexed by this problem because he was caught between rock and a hard place, as you can imagine. So I called him and said, do you have any idea why Japan is interested in reviving time after time this issue of Tokto, for example? And he said, you got me. He has no idea. He told me that poll after poll of the popular opinion on this issue showed, at best, a blurred, torn sort of indecisiveness on the part of people of Japan, not the leadership. Sort of agnostic attitude on their part. And the question is, what is this gesture tailored to? And as a person who had to be under his call of duty as an ambassador to Japan, thoroughly familiar with the nature of this, the texture of popular opinion making. He couldn't come to grips with it. So I like to ask the expert here, for whom I have enormous respect, Dr. Kim, what in his opinion explains this persistent pursuit of controversy in this regard. And also, my brother has also his indigenously weird theory about this matter. He said it takes two to tango, and for Japan to thrive on this controversy requires immediate and evocative response from Korea and China. Just imagine what would happen if Japan slaps us and nothing happens. We smile. We tell them to keep on doing it. Nothing would happen. They wouldn't get their mileage out of this. And the question is, not Japan, but why is Korea doing this? And China responding every time, dance to the tune that Japan produces. And my brother's argument is interesting in the sense that he says we should celebrate the temple visit. Why? It stands as a symbol of a moronic engagement on the part of Japan in the Pacific War. Truly idiotic engagement. Reckless as hell. The thing that ultimately brought down Japan and that ultimately led to the cessation of Japanese annexation of Korea. So shouldn't we get up and sing a song or two, encourage them to keep on visiting the temple? Because that stands as our liberation. And I thought that was rather interesting and unique view of the whole thing. But you know, the subtext of this is much more interesting than important to some of you, but to me it's much more important than interesting. Why? Because I think what he's trying to say is that we are feeding the Japanese motivation for continuing this particular matter. And I agree with him. There's one final thing that is at least, at best, peripheral to Dr. Kim's argument and may not have anything to do with it. He's mentioned, very correctly mentioned, Kono statement that was based on testimonies that had nothing to do with victimization. Vaguely reminded me of Congressman Dara Isa's hearing that he held last year, February 16th, as some of you may remember, concerning pro-choice, pro-life debate, abortion, and contraception. And he called 5 witnesses to, as you remember, he as you may know, he chairs a very powerful government reform and government overseeing committee. And he didn't call one single woman. He called 5 men. Supposedly, he performed the duty of formulating policy on the basis of male testimony alone. And I thought, I know that's at best a questionable linkage that I'm building forcefully between the Kono statement and Dara Isa. But as a person who is interested in American politics, I couldn't resist the temptation. Finally, Professor Maxwell's fine paper that I read as a really terrific normative template for what to do when time is ready, or even before time is ready. But again, in the tradition of my brother, and this is me speaking this time, not my younger brother, I'd like to ask a question or two. Well, first of all, a comment. He said, I think he said, if I remember, that United States has both moral and practical interest in this matter of Korean reunification. Well, I would like to see that for myself restated. Combination of moral and practical, because on moral alone, United States does not have a very good record. nor does it have a good record on practical. So when you combine the two, I think it does present somewhat formidable argument here. The second thing I want to say is an outrageous question, and that is, why couldn't the status quo be maintained indefinitely? What are its costs? What kind of bleeding do we expect? You know, my famous quote always comes from this man, which serves as a wonderful lesson, not only for my political science that I try to study, but also my life. And that is, H.L. Mencken of Maryland was once asked by a bunch of journalists who dogged him and said, Mr. Mencken, why do you love your wife? And he said, as compared to what? Well, it seems to me that the status of the peninsula, when we say couldn't be maintained this way, my question is, as compared to what? As compared to unification? What guarantee is there that only, and I'm quoting him, reunification will produce acceptable security solution in Northeast Asia? Now, I remember that Professor Liu, I think, added a sort of a revisionist view of expected Russian veto, or the statement of Russian veto. But if that is true, that Russian veto is something that we can expect, then doesn't the unification pose an ominous future as well of its own kind, rather than the status quo? So that's what I like to. So that's the end of my review.
Okay.
How many minutes do I have?
Not much time.
5 minutes?
Next session starts at 4. We will, let's say we'll finish by 5 minutes to 4. So we have
You guys
5 minutes
to spend
altogether,
too much
including-
time.
I didn't.
Okay, I'm happy to be a part of this panel with distinguished and respected scholars and professionals, all long-time friends also. I'm happy to talk with. Gordon wrote on China, Professor Nakin on Japan, and David on United States, relate to the development of international relations on the Korean Peninsula. When I pass this building and come to this building, I have a nostalgic feeling of just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I came here at least 2 or 3 times to participate in conference. The rarely need to know that when the Bill Taylor's in charge of the place, right? It's very hot discussions we had here. On Gordon Chang's paper, mostly I agree with him, and but I think still China has great leverage to influence North Korea because of energy and food. According to World Food Program, year 2012, China provided nearly 2/3 of the 372,000 metric tons of food assistance to North Korea. 2/3 of it. North Korea received also 245,000 metric tons of heavy fuel oil and equivalent during 2007-9, before six-party talks broke down. Now, North Korea mostly depends on the supply of fuel oil through the pipeline from China. I believe that China has powerful leverage to influence North Korea, but Chinese leader may think that they still need North Korea for its strategic interest. That's my guess. About the China and North Korea issues, China does not support DPRK news. China does not force them to follow the China's model of economic development. And China supports UN economic sanctions on DPRK. In this regard, generally speaking, I am relatively positive in viewing the development of Sino-South Korean relations because of following reasons. International relations. Last week, Chinese ambassador to United States, Hui Jiankai, participated in the opening ceremony of 6th China-US project on crisis avoidance cooperation held at USIP, where he delivered a keynote speech on the new model of major country relationship between China and the United States. He said that the key to our success in avoiding crisis is to turn dangers into opportunities for cooperation to make a better world for all. That's a very important message. So this message is China wants to keep its G2 position, status, reputation based on norms and rules of international community so that it will cast fair vote in the United Nations, which is favorable to South Korea. Second, in domestic politics, the level of Chinese civilization has improved compared to 2 decades ago, so that massive information flew into China in the age of information technology. That makes more liberalized toward the democratization. I think current leadership of China fully understand that the importance of the public demand for democratization, which is favorable to South Korea. In economy, the Chinese economy requires industrial restructure, but will adjust for continuous growth just like Japan and South Korea in the past. Moreover, the free trade agreement between China and South Korea, though it is now under negotiations, will increase trade and investment, which will be mutually beneficial, contribute to the Sino-South Korean relations. And national security. China wants peace on the Korean peninsula, the nuclearized peninsula, so that any aggressive actions from the north could be constrained by the Chinese influence. There are minor problems such as territorial dispute or air defense identification zone of the East Asia Sea, which is important, but which would not be a problem between China and South Korea in the near future. In society and culture, massive transactions of goods and services between China and South Korea increases the number of people who come and go, which promote mutual understanding between 2 countries. Korean movies and dramas are circulated throughout China almost at the same day that can emotionally or culturally synchronize peoples, the 2 countries. That may be significant in the long run. That's my comment on first paper. Second paper, Professor Hong Nak Kim is a very respectable scholar, long time my friend. my senior friends, but because I'm not specialized in Japan, so I read the paper as a lecture of my professor. So he spent almost 30 minutes to presentations. Fortunately, I need just 3 minutes to talk about it.
You have to give you some time to respond.
Okay. Okay, I'll skip it then. Actually, I wrote 1 page for comments, but I'll skip this, okay? David's, one of the most important part is the extension of OPCON on the CFC. I think it's the most important part of the U.S. support for the Korean unification efforts. So actually North Korea threats South Korea, but North Korea cannot attack South Korea because no enough energy and food. They don't have external support from China or Russia. Also, North Korea faced tremendous runaway of soldiers and civilians out of regime control, so that as soon as the war starts, that's very dangerous. There's collapse only. Also, North Korea cannot use nuclear weapons because of 2 reasons. Number 1, immediate retaliation. Number 2, Korean region is too narrow. The wind direction changes all the time. If they use even tactical nuclear weapons, the wind flow the other way, then North Korea would be the damage, fallout. So it's not easy. Also retaliation. Any country using the nuclear weapons in the world will be retaliated immediately for the world order, either by the United States or any other countries. Nuclear is just, so in other words, nuclear weapon, DPRK should know that former Soviet Union could not survive with nuclear weapon. But they don't know this. Thank you very much.
Looks like 3 presenters will have like 1.5 minutes to respond. Will you start, Mr. Chang?
Yeah. Hugo, thanks for the comments. And I agree, China does have a lot of influence with North Korea, certainly has a lot of sway, but I think over the long term the trend is downwards rather than anything else. And I think partially because the North Koreans have figured out that the Chinese supply all of this oil and food and money largely for China's own benefit. So the North Koreans think, well, they're not going to turn us off. And that is a practical matter, gives North Korea a lot of leverage in the relationship.
Dr. Kim?
Let me say first that as far as Abe government is concerned, this is the first government in the post-war period which tried to take a revisionist view of history. I don't think there was any government which tried to do that before Abe as far as revisionist view of history was concerned. And in a sense, it may be related to his view that Japan is a great nation, and maybe it's related to Japan's superiority complex. I mean, all the other people just not quite up to Japan as far as Asian countries are concerned. Okay. The third one.
Next panel.
Okay. All right. I would just add one more item, and that is as far as.
We'll have to follow up in private.
Yeah. Well, as far as the one final comment I want to make here is concerned, I think Abe is doing this in order to allow or strengthen Japan's nationalism. In other words, he wants to make Japan a great nation. He wants to make Japan a normal state. he want to make Japan first-tier state, which can play a great role in international politics. And as long as Japan maintains present constitution with Article 9, wouldn't be able to do it. So this is why he is doing that. Thank you.
So nice.